During World War II, nations raced to create weapons that would decide the fate of the world, but not every idea made it to the battlefield. Some were so outrageous, so dangerously unpredictable, they were hidden away or abandoned altogether. From rocket-powered wheels gone rogue to exploding bats that burned their own bases, these aren't science fiction theory real. These are the 5 most bizarre World War II weapons that were too dangerous to ever deploy, and you're about to see why. In the final years of the Second World War, as Nazi Germany faced the crushing weight of Allied forces from both East and West, its leadership turned increasingly to desperation and madness. Deep beneath the mountains of Bavaria, hidden in one of Hitler's most secretive research bunkers, a team of elite Nazi scientists was working on a weapon that defied logic, science, and sanity. They called it Project Sonnenschütze, or the Sun Gun. The idea came from the minds of those under the influence of SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, a man obsessed with esotericism, ancient myths, and weaponizing unorthodox sciences. The concept was terrifyingly simple in theory: a giant mirror, placed in orbit around Earth, that would reflect and concentrate sunlight into a focused beam strong enough to ignite fires, melt cities, or blind and burn enemy troops across continents. The weapon, they claimed, would be able to reduce any Allied capital to ashes from space, with nothing but the power of the sun. The initial inspiration was actually drawn from an early 20th century German physicist, Hermann Oberth, who had theorized the possibility of using giant mirrors in space for peaceful purposes like illuminating cities at night. The Nazi scientists took that theory and turned it into a blueprint of destruction. According to documents recovered after the war, the Nazi plan involved launching a mirror roughly 100 meters in diameter into a stable geostationary orbit. This mirror would be made of a reflective metal alloy, constructed in pieces and assembled by astronauts aboard a proposed Nazi space station, which was itself the stuff of fantasy more than engineering. The mirror would act like a magnifying glass, concentrating solar rays into a single fiery beam directed at the Earth's surface. What was truly astonishing wasn't just the science fiction-like ambition, but how seriously the Nazis treated the concept. Sketches and engineering documents revealed calculations for orbital dynamics, potential materials, and hypothetical fuel sources. They even proposed using V-2 rocket technology, still in its infancy, to begin building the necessary launch systems. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, would later recount in his memoirs that Hitler himself was intensely fascinated by the idea of a death ray from the sky. It played into his messianic delusions and desire to wield godlike power. In Hitler's mind, this sun gun would be the ultimate weapon, capable of reversing the tides of war and punishing his enemies with celestial fire. Yet, the entire project was riddled with impossibilities. For starters, Nazi Germany was nowhere near launching anything into space. The V-2 rockets, while groundbreaking, could only reach the edge of space in suborbital flights. The concept of constructing a mirror of that size in orbit would be challenging even with today's technology. There were no materials that could survive such construction, no systems to control the orientation of the mirror, and no ability to assemble anything in zero gravity. Then came the logistical nightmares. Where would the funding come from? The war machine was already stretched thin. Cities were burning, supply lines were fractured, and German industry was being bombed daily. Still, the Nazis allocated a small but dedicated team to keep exploring the idea, likely more for propaganda and psychological hope than actual execution. One of the most bizarre elements of the project was its overlap with the so-called Wunderwaffe, or Wonder Weapons program, a catch-all term for a range of high-concept superweapons that the Third Reich promised would save them. Alongside jet fighters, guided missiles, and electromagnetic cannons, the sun gun stood out as perhaps the most ludicrous. But to the men in charge, it was a symbol of divine vengeance, a literal eye in the sky, able to burn entire nations. The Allies, of course, had no idea such a concept was being tossed around in underground bunkers. But after the war, American and Soviet forces alike were stunned when they uncovered documents related to the project during the raid on Nazi scientific facilities, especially those linked to the German Army Weapons Agency and SS research divisions. These plans were one of many unusual finds that led to Operation Paperclip, the secret American program to recruit German scientists before the Soviets could get to them. Though the Sun gun never left the pages of Nazi engineering notebooks, the idea itself lingered in the imaginations of Cold War strategists. In the 1960s, the U.S. military flirted briefly with space-based weapons, though nothing as absurd as orbital mirrors, leading to treaties banning the weaponization of space. Ironically, the absurdity of the Nazi Sun gun may have influenced early Cold War fears, including the infamous Star Wars missile defense proposals of the Reagan era. Looking back, it's difficult not to see the Nazi Sun gun as both a delusion and a prophecy. It encapsulated the bizarre intersection of technological ambition, military desperation, and dictatorial fantasy. The Nazis had already scorched the earth. Now they wanted to scorch it from the heavens. In the end, the war ended before even a single piece of the mirror could be fabricated. Allied troops stormed Germany, Hitler perished in his bunker, and the mad dreams of a solar death beam were buried beneath the ruins of a fascist regime. In the endless, frozen fields of the Eastern Front, where the clash between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union reached nightmarish proportions, the Soviet military found itself forced to innovate under extreme pressure. Outnumbered, under-equipped, and reeling from the brutal onslaught of Operation Barbarossa, Soviet commanders needed any advantage they could find. But desperation often gives birth to monstrosities. In 1941, the Red Army unveiled one of the most shocking weapons of the entire war: dogs strapped with explosives, trained to destroy enemy tanks. It began with the Soviet Union's Central Military School of Working Dogs, which had been breeding and training canines for military use since the 1920s. Initially, dogs were used for communication, search and rescue, and sentry duty. But with the Nazi invasion pushing deep into Soviet territory, High Command called for unconventional solutions to slow the German armored advance. Enter the so-called anti-tank dogs, a program designed to transform loyal animals into mobile mines. The concept was disturbingly simple. A dog would be equipped with a harness carrying between 10 to 12 kilograms of TNT. A long wooden lever or protruding detonator would be rigged to trigger upon contact with the underside of a tank. The dogs were trained to associate food with enemy vehicles. In theory, they would run underneath German tanks to search for food and, boom, the explosive would detonate upon contact. The training process was grim. Soviet handlers starved the dogs for days, then placed food under stationary tanks to condition them. Over time, the dogs were introduced to engine sounds and battlefield chaos. The belief was that they could reliably identify enemy tanks, run underneath them, and destroy them in suicidal missions. On paper, it sounded efficient. In practice, it became a disaster. In the heat of battle, the dogs became confused. Many of the tanks used during training were of Soviet design, and the animals couldn't differentiate between friend and foe. The chaotic roar of engines, gunfire, smoke, and screaming soldiers overwhelmed them. Dozens of dogs turned back towards Soviet trenches, still strapped with active explosives. Several units reported devastating accidents where their own troops were killed by their canine weapons. There are documented cases, particularly during the Battle of Kursk in 1943, where these dogs were deployed en masse. According to Soviet reports, the program did manage to destroy or disable several German tanks, though Western historians and German records dispute the effectiveness, suggesting that very few, if any, actual kills were confirmed. Some German tank crews, upon realizing what the Soviets were doing, began shooting any dog seen near the front lines. Others installed makeshift defenses around their tanks, including barbed wire or flamethrowers to repel approaching animals. The German High Command was both horrified and fascinated. Propaganda units published leaflets describing the inhuman cruelty of the Soviets, portraying them as monsters who would even sacrifice man's best friend for the sake of battle. But internally, German officers recognized the potential threat and issued orders to be vigilant. Back in the Soviet Union, the program's failure was quietly buried under layers of wartime secrecy. The military never publicly acknowledged how many of their own soldiers died due to misdirected dogs. Nor did they reveal how many animals were lost in vain. After the war, references to the anti-tank dogs were largely scrubbed from official military history, though whispers of the project continued among veterans. Years later, Soviet military dog trainers reflected on the trauma the animals endured. The dogs had no understanding of war, only that they were hungry and scared. What the Soviet Union had done, in its desperation to repel the Nazis, was weaponize innocence. The cost was not just human, it was moral. And yet, even after the Second World War ended, the idea didn't entirely die. During the Cold War, rumors emerged that both Soviet and American forces briefly revisited the idea of animal-based sabotage, exploring everything from dolphins carrying mines to pigeons guiding bombs. None, however, reached the grotesque simplicity or tragic legacy of the Soviet anti-tank dogs. In 1990, a declassified Soviet training manual surfaced, containing diagrams of the dog harness and step-by-step instructions for training. The world was reminded of what wartime fear can justify, and what horrors are hidden behind closed military doors. It showed not just a willingness to try anything, but a cold calculation that blurred the line between ingenuity and cruelty. Modern Russia occasionally honors its wartime dogs, though few memorials dare to reference the anti-tank program. Some surviving trainers from the era insisted that the dogs were heroes, sacrificing themselves to protect the motherland. Others, particularly post-war historians, argue that the dogs were victims, used and discarded like equipment. Today, the story of the Soviet dog bombs stands as a grim symbol of the desperation and brutality of total war. It is a tale of loyalty betrayed, of good intentions turned into horror, and of the blurry line where strategy becomes savagery. In late 1944, as the tides of war turned decisively against the Empire of Japan, military leaders began searching for a way to strike directly at the American mainland. Conventional attacks were impossible. Japan's navy was crippled, its air force dwindling, and its industrial resources stretched to their limits. What they needed was a weapon that required no pilot, no ship, and no direct contact, a weapon that could quietly cross the vast Pacific and sow fear, destruction, and chaos. Their solution? Balloons. Known officially as Fugo, these silent killers were hydrogen-filled paper balloons carrying incendiary bombs and, in some cases, high-explosive anti-personnel charges. The Japanese hoped to take advantage of a newly discovered natural phenomenon, the high-altitude jet stream. At nearly 30,000 feet above sea level, winds could carry a lightweight object from Japan to North America in just a few days. Japanese scientists and meteorologists had studied this current for years, and by late 1944, they believed they could harness it to create the world's first intercontinental weapon. The plan was as ambitious as it was bizarre. Over 9,000 Fugo balloons were crafted in secret, many by Japanese schoolgirls and women under tight military supervision. The balloons themselves were marvels of resourcefulness, constructed from washi paper glued together with a mixture of potato flour paste and horsehide glue. Each balloon had a diameter of over 10 meters and carried a payload of around 15 kilograms. Ingeniously, each Fugo was equipped with a barometric pressure system and an onboard altimeter that controlled a series of ballast sandbags. If the balloon dipped too low, the device would drop a bag to regain altitude. If it went too high, a vent would release hydrogen. The idea was to keep the balloon hovering within the jet stream for several days, until it reached the skies over North America. Upon descent, triggered by a timer or loss of hydrogen, the balloon would drop its bombs. The incendiary devices were designed to ignite wildfires in American forests, ideally during dry seasons, while the anti-personnel bombs would explode on impact, causing injuries and terror. Between November 1944 and April 1945, the Japanese launched their silent armada. Though many balloons fell into the ocean or failed to complete the journey, around 300 reached the United States and Canada. Balloons were spotted or recovered in California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Arizona, and as far inland as Michigan. One was even found in Mexico. The American government quickly realized what was happening but chose to implement a news blackout to avoid public panic, and, more critically, to prevent Japan from learning how successful the attacks had been. Newspapers were ordered not to report balloon sightings or explosions. Military and civilian personnel were quietly dispatched to locate and recover any remnants of the devices. Despite the limited damage caused by most of the balloons, tragedy struck on May 5, 1945. Near Bly, Oregon, a pastor and his family were enjoying a picnic when they discovered a strange object in the forest. As the group approached, the balloon's bomb detonated, killing 6 people, including 5 children. It remains the only instance of enemy action causing deaths on the U.S. mainland during World War II. The Japanese never learned about the success or failure of their campaign, due to the American media silence. They had no way to track the balloons, and with no reported results, the program was eventually abandoned. Still, their persistence was staggering. Japanese forces continued to launch Fugo balloons well into the spring of 1945, even as their cities were being firebombed and their empire crumbled. From a military standpoint, the Fugo campaign was a failure. It caused minimal damage, started only a handful of small fires, and had no meaningful impact on the war effort. But from a psychological and technological perspective, it was ahead of its time. The idea of long-range unmanned weapons, guided not by radio signals but by the forces of nature, foreshadowed the era of drones and intercontinental missiles. After the war, many of the recovered balloons were studied by American engineers, who were both amused and impressed by the ingenuity of the design. The delicate balance mechanisms, the handmade paper, the creative use of natural wind currents, these were not the inventions of a technologically backward enemy, but the work of a desperate nation pushing the limits of unconventional warfare. In the decades that followed, Fugo balloons continued to resurface. Hikers in the Pacific Northwest stumbled upon rusted fragments. Loggers unearthed unexploded devices. As recently as the 2010s, live ordnance from Fugo bombs has been found and safely detonated by military experts. Each discovery serves as a ghostly reminder that war leaves behind long shadows, and not all weapons explode on schedule. Today, in Bly, Oregon, a small monument stands at the site of the fatal explosion. It's a quiet place, nestled in the woods, far from the battlefields of Europe or the Pacific. It honors the 6 lives lost and marks the strange chapter in history when war floated silently across the sea, carried by wind and fear. On the windswept beaches of Devon, England, sometime in 1943, a bizarre machine thundered across the sand, spinning out of control, spraying explosives, and terrifying onlookers. It looked like something out of a steampunk fever dream. 2 enormous wheels connected by a massive steel drum, each wheel rigged with dozens of cordite rockets. This was not a failed carnival ride. It was Britain's top-secret weapon, known simply as the Great Panjandrum. Developed by the British Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. Yes, that was a real department. The Great Panjandrum was designed to solve a very specific and terrifying problem: how to breach Nazi beach defenses during the planned D-Day invasion. German forces had fortified the Atlantic Wall with concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and minefields. The British needed a way to punch through these fortifications quickly and safely, ideally without risking human lives in the initial assault. One proposed solution: launch a huge, rocket-powered wheel of death loaded with explosives directly into enemy positions. The Panjandrum would consist of 2 10-foot-tall wheels, joined by a central axle housing nearly a ton of explosives. Each wheel was lined with cordite rockets, military-grade propellants, angled to propel the device forward like a spinning missile. The plan was to launch it from a landing craft and let it race up the beach at nearly 60 miles per hour, smashing through obstacles and detonating inside a concrete bunker. In theory, it sounded wild but possible. In reality, it was mayhem. Initial tests took place on the quiet beaches of WWII, a town with one of the only punctuation marks in its name and, apparently, an appetite for madness. British engineers arrived in secret, rigging up the enormous machine and lighting the rockets. Soldiers, officers, and even a few war correspondents gathered behind a safe distance of sand dunes. On the first test, the Panjandrum shuddered forward, and immediately fell apart. The rockets fired unevenly, causing the wheels to spin erratically. The contraption veered wildly off course, eventually collapsing into a smoldering heap. The engineers, undeterred, added more rockets. With each test, the Panjandrum became faster and more unpredictable. On one run, it suddenly reversed course, heading straight toward the watching dignitaries and forcing everyone to scatter for their lives. On another, one of the rockets came loose, corkscrewing into the sand and narrowly missing a naval officer. By the final test, The beach was littered with failed rocket casings and the stench of burnt cordite. Still, the British had to see the thing in action with its full payload. So, they loaded it with a fake warhead, strapped on dozens of rockets, and gave it one last go. The machine roared to life, shooting forward like a demon on wheels. Then it wobbled, spun in a circle, tipped, and exploded in a violent, fiery tantrum. Shards of metal and splinters flew in every direction. Observers dove to the ground. The Great Panjandrum had completed its final journey, in pieces. Military command, now fully aware of the weapon's instability, quietly scrapped the project. The Panjandrum was never mentioned in D-Day planning again. Other methods, including conventional explosives, bulldozers, and specialized tanks, would take the place of rocket-powered wheels. Yet, the Panjandrum lives on in infamy. It became a symbol of British eccentricity, brilliant minds trying desperately to outthink the horrors of modern war with contraptions pulled from a Jules Verne novel. It was also a reminder that not all wartime innovation is practical or sane. After the war, the Panjandrum became something of a legend. Veterans who witnessed the tests told the story like it was folklore, half believed, half mythologized. Historians who stumbled upon the schematics wondered if it was a joke. It wasn't. A replica of the Panjandrum was even built decades later for educational demonstrations, complete with rockets and steel wheels. Unsurprisingly, the replica also failed catastrophically, proving that some ideas are simply doomed from the start. But the Panjandrum wasn't just a failed weapon. It was a reflection of the pressures inventors faced during the most desperate years of the war. The Allies knew they needed to innovate to win. The Germans had V-2 rockets, jet fighters, and submarine pens. The British had brilliance, courage, and sometimes utter insanity. While it never rolled across Normandy, the Great Panjandrum remains an iconic symbol of WWII's lesser-known attempts at victory. In a war filled with devastation and darkness, it's almost comforting to know that somewhere on a beach, a giant flaming wheel once spun wildly into the sea, not as an instrument of death, but as an emblem of human audacity. In the summer of 1942, as America scrambled to strike back after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt received a letter. It wasn't from a general or a senator, but from a Pennsylvania dentist named Lytle S. Adams. And it contained a proposal so unusual, so outrageous, that it somehow made it all the way to the White House. Dr. Adams had recently returned from a vacation in Carlsbad Caverns, New Mexico, where he'd witnessed a swirling cloud of bats emerging from the cave at dusk. The sight stuck with him. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, Adams, like many Americans, wanted to contribute to the war effort. That's when his mind returned to those bats. What if they could be used as weapons? Adams proposed using bats as delivery systems for incendiary bombs. His plan was equal parts absurd and inspired. Attach small timed firebombs to live bats, release them over Japanese cities at dawn, and let the bats seek shelter in the eaves and attics of the predominantly wood and paper buildings. When the timers ignited, the result would be widespread, uncontrollable fires. The idea made its way to Roosevelt's science advisor, who, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of wartime desperation, green-lit it. Thus was born Project X-Ray, America's secret bat bomb program. The U.S. military turned to the Mexican free-tailed bat, a common species capable of carrying up to their own body weight in flight. Researchers at multiple universities were drafted into service, including a young Dr. Louis Fieser, who would later help invent napalm. The team designed tiny, lightweight incendiary devices with time delay fuses, weighing less than an ounce. These were strapped to the bats' chests using small harnesses made of thin wire and cloth. But how would they deliver thousands of bats into enemy skies? Engineers designed a bomb-shaped canister with trays holding the bats, kept in hibernation by refrigeration. Once dropped from a B-24 bomber at high altitude, the canister would deploy a parachute, open mid-air, and release the bats as they warmed up and woke from their artificial slumber. In theory, the creatures would instinctively fly into dark buildings below, just before the timers detonated. Early tests at Muroc Army Airfield, now Edwards Air Force Base, were mixed. In one instance, The bats were accidentally released too early, flying into hangars and barracks. Several caught fire mid-flight, setting parts of the base ablaze. Ironically, the only real damage the bat bombs ever caused was to American military property. Despite this, the project showed promise. In a large-scale test at the Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Air Base, mock Japanese villages were constructed and subjected to bat attacks. The results were surprising. Fires ignited across multiple buildings, spreading faster than expected. Military officials noted that the bat bombs were potentially more destructive than conventional incendiary raids, and far cheaper. By 1943, the military invested serious funding into the project, up to $2 million, a staggering amount for such an experimental weapon. But just as Project X-Ray seemed poised for full development, it ran into bureaucracy. Delays mounted. Testing facilities struggled to maintain the bat colonies. Animal rights concerns, minimal as they were at the time, started to surface among scientists. Then, the Manhattan Project entered its final phase. As the atomic bomb became a tangible reality, military focus shifted entirely. In 1944, the bat bomb was officially shelved. It had been scheduled for deployment in mid-1945, but the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war before the bats ever left American soil. Many scientists involved with Project X-Ray expressed frustration at its cancellation. Some believed it could have burned large swathes of Tokyo without the human toll of atomic bombs. Others, in hindsight, acknowledged the moral ambiguity of weaponizing living animals for mass destruction. After the war, Project X-Ray was largely forgotten. Documents were declassified in the 1950s, prompting curiosity and disbelief. For decades, the idea was seen more as wartime trivia than a serious weapon. But in the early 2000s, researchers revisited the concept and confirmed that the bat bomb, strange as it was, had real tactical viability. It could have worked, perhaps too well. Today, the idea of strapping firebombs to live animals sounds like something out of a dystopian novel. But during World War II, when the world was on fire and innovation was born from urgency, the bizarre was often just another solution. Lytle Adams, the dentist-turned-inventor, never received a medal, but he left behind one of the war's most surreal legacies. Bat bombs were never used in combat. But their story is a reminder of how war stretches the boundaries of morality, science, and imagination. Sometimes, the most unbelievable weapons were almost real. Every case adds a new layer of mystery, leaving more questions than answers. Which one lingers in your mind, and what's your take on what really happened?